That's the one and only Stevie Nicks, whose songs have touched the lives of millions, both for her work with Fleetwood Mac and for her solo career.
Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham weren't just bandmates in Fleetwood Mac. They were once a couple whose breakup played out in front of the whole world. For decades, fans have heard pieces of their story through interviews, song lyrics, and rumors. But in recent years, Stevie has opened up more than ever before. Join us as we uncover what Stevie Nicks has revealed about Lindsey Buckingham and the truth that changed everything. Before the storm. Stevie Nicks was born Stephanie Lynn Nicks on May 26, 1948, in Phoenix, Arizona. She grew up in a family that moved often because of her father's job as a food business executive. This constant change meant Stevie never stayed in one place for too long, but it also gave her a wide view of the world. From an early age, music was at the center of her life. Her grandfather, Aaron Jess A.J. Nicks Sr., was a country singer who taught her to sing and even harmonize. Stevie loved those moments and began singing duets with him when she was very young. By the time she was in her early teens, she was writing her own songs. Even in her earliest lyrics, she leaned toward themes that would later define her career: mystery, love, heartbreak, and stories inspired by her imagination. She often filled notebooks with ideas, never quite knowing how far her passion for songwriting would take her. Stevie first crossed paths with Lindsey Buckingham while attending Menlo Atherton High School in Northern California. They weren't close friends at the time, but they knew of each other through mutual acquaintances. The real connection happened a few years later when Lindsey needed a singer for his band. Someone suggested Stevie, and after hearing her sing, Lindsey asked her to join. The band they played in together was called Fritz, a Bay Area group that performed psychedelic rock and cover songs at local venues. Fritz never became a household name, but they opened for big acts like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, which gave Stevie and Lindsey a taste of the larger music scene. Performing together built a strong musical bond between them. At the same time, their personal relationship grew. Stevie and Lindsey began dating, and their connection deepened both on and off stage. Their voices blended naturally, and they quickly learned how to complement each other's style. This partnership would go on to shape both of their careers, even as their romance later faced challenges. After Fritz disbanded in 1971, Stevie and Lindsey decided to keep working together. They packed up their lives and moved to Los Angeles to chase a record deal. Money was tight, and life in the city was far from glamorous. Stevie took on waitressing and cleaning jobs to help pay the bills while Lindsey focused on their music. In 1973, they released their debut album, Buckingham Nicks. The record showcased their harmonies and songwriting skills, blending folk, pop, and rock elements. Songs like Crying in the Night and Long Distance Winter showed their potential, but the album failed to sell well. Their label dropped them, leaving the duo uncertain about the future. This period tested their relationship. The struggle to make it in the music industry created stress, and the reality of low income weighed heavily on Stevie. She considered leaving music at one point to return to school, but ultimately decided to keep going. Despite the setback, they continued writing and performing wherever they could, holding on to the hope that something bigger was around the corner. The Fleetwood Mac breakthrough. That something bigger came in 1974, thanks to a twist of fate. Mick Fleetwood, drummer and co-founder of the British-American band Fleetwood Mac, was looking for a new guitarist after Bob Welch left the group. He heard a recording that featured Lindsey's guitar work and was impressed. When Mick approached Lindsey about joining, Lindsey said he would only do it if Stevie could join as well. It was a risky demand. Fleetwood Mac was already an established band, and bringing in not one but two new members could have changed the group's chemistry. Still, Mick agreed to meet Stevie. She performed for him, and her unique voice and presence won him over. Both Stevie and Lindsey officially joined Fleetwood Mac on New Year's Eve of 1974. Their first album with the band, Fleetwood Mac, was an instant success. Stevie's song Rhiannon became one of the standout tracks with its haunting melody and mystical lyrics inspired by a Welsh myth. Another song, Landslide, written about her uncertainties in life and career, struck an emotional chord with listeners and remains one of her most beloved works. The success was overwhelming for Stevie, who had gone from struggling to pay rent to being part of one of the most popular bands in the world. She had a distinctive stage presence, flowing shawls, platform boots, and a mysterious aura that made her unforgettable. Her voice, songwriting, and image set her apart from other female artists of the time, and it was clear she had found her place in music. Stevie's life was about to become far more complicated as fame brought new pressures and her relationship with Lindsey began to unravel. But that's where the real drama starts. Relationship with Lindsey. When Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham joined Fleetwood Mac at the end of 1974, they were already a couple. They moved into a small apartment in Los Angeles and carried both their romantic and musical partnership into the band. In the early days, their creative connection was strong. They wrote together, sang harmonies that blended effortlessly, and supported each other's ideas in the studio. But life in Fleetwood Mac was far more intense than anything they had experienced before. The band quickly went from a respected but modest act to one of the most talked-about rock groups in America. With that rise came constant touring, endless interviews, and a spotlight that never turned off. Living and working together under these conditions began to take its toll. Artistic synergy often turned into personal friction. Lindsey had strong opinions about arrangements and production, sometimes insisting on doing things his way. Stevie, while respectful of his talent, wanted her own creative freedom. At home, the lines between personal life and professional life blurred. Arguments in the apartment sometimes spilled into the studio, and disagreements in the studio often followed them home. Fame amplified every issue. The band's schedule was punishing. Weeks of touring, then straight back into recording, then more shows. Privacy was rare, and the media loved to focus on the California couple in the band. That outside attention added even more strain, especially when rumors about their relationship started to spread. As Fleetwood Mac's fame grew, the pressures of the road and personal differences deepened the cracks in Stevie and Lindsey's relationship. The rock scene in the 1970s was full of temptation. Parties, late nights, and constant travel meant that relationships were rarely simple. Rumors of affairs began to swirl around both of them. Some of these were whispered about by insiders, while others became openly discussed among fans and the press. Stevie has spoken in interviews about how Lindsey's personality became increasingly controlling over time. She often described him as intense and sometimes possessive, especially about the music they made together. While Lindsey was focused on precision and structure, Stevie was naturally more spontaneous and independent. That difference in how they approached life and art created emotional distance between them. On Lindsey's side, there was frustration that Stevie was becoming more of the public face of Fleetwood Mac. Songs like Rhiannon and Landslide had made her a standout, and her distinctive style and stage presence drew massive attention. Some insiders believed Lindsey resented how quickly she became the focal point for fans, even though her success also lifted the whole band. By the middle of the 1970s, it was clear that their romance was slipping away. They still performed together and worked on each other's songs, but in private they were drifting further apart. The breakup in public. By 1976, the end of Stevie and Lindsey's relationship was inevitable, and it happened in the middle of creating what would become Fleetwood Mac's most famous album, Rumors. The breakup wasn't a quiet, private matter. It unfolded right in the middle of the studio with other band members watching. To make things even more tense, the rest of the band was also going through major personal upheaval. Christine McVie and her husband, bassist John McVie, were divorcing. Mick Fleetwood was in the middle of his own marital breakdown. The atmosphere during the Rumors sessions was full of tension, hurt feelings, and barely concealed anger. In that environment, Stevie and Lindsey wrote some of their most famous and most pointed songs. Lindsey's Go Your Own Way was a direct message to Stevie, telling her in blunt terms that their relationship was over and placing much of the blame on her. The line, "Shacking up's all you want to do," especially upset Stevie, as she felt it was not only untrue, but also damaging to her reputation. Stevie responded with Dreams, a more reflective but still clear statement about the breakup. Her song spoke about freedom, change, and the sadness of letting go. The contrast between Lindsey's sharp tone and Stevie's wistful approach was striking, and both songs became massive hits. Fans loved the emotional rawness, even though it meant the wounds between the two were still open. The recording process was grueling. Band members often recorded their parts separately to avoid face-to-face confrontation. When they did end up in the studio together, there were cold silences or sudden arguments. Despite the personal chaos, the music they created during this time was powerful and cohesive. It was as if the emotional fire between them pushed them to perform at their very best. When Rumors was released in 1977, it became one of the best-selling albums in history. The success meant that Stevie and Lindsey had to keep working together, even though their romance had ended badly. Walking away from Fleetwood Mac at that point would have meant giving up a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so both of them chose to stay, at least professionally. Their musical chemistry didn't disappear after the breakup. On stage, they could still sing in harmony and bring each other's songs to life. But behind the scenes, things were volatile. There were moments when the tension spilled into live performances, sharp looks, body language that told a different story than the music, and occasional pointed comments from the microphone. Offstage, the two still clashed. Creative disagreements were common, and old resentments surfaced often. Stevie has said in later interviews that Lindsey could be dismissive of her ideas, while Lindsey sometimes felt Stevie was distant or uninterested in working closely with him anymore. Even so, they knew that their combined talents were part of what made Fleetwood Mac so successful. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Stevie and Lindsey continued to navigate this complicated professional relationship. There were moments of civility and even friendship, but the underlying hurt from their breakup never fully went away. They were bound together by the music, even if they couldn't repair what had been broken in their personal lives. The real trouble, though, was only just beginning. Things between Stevie and Lindsey were about to turn from tense to explosive. Power struggles and personal battles. After Rumors turned Fleetwood Mac into one of the biggest bands in the world, the pressure to keep that success going was intense. Lindsey Buckingham took on a stronger role in shaping the band's sound. He was deeply involved in arrangements, production, and the creative direction of new material. Lindsey had a clear vision for where he wanted the band to go musically, and he worked tirelessly to achieve it. However, his approach was often very precise and controlling. He liked to experiment with new recording techniques, push songs into unconventional structures, and sometimes rework band members' material until it fit his style. While this level of involvement helped create some of Fleetwood Mac's most acclaimed music, it also caused friction, especially with Stevie Nicks. Stevie was used to writing songs in her own way. Her process was more instinctive and emotional, and she often came into the studio with songs she felt were already complete in their essence. When Lindsey made big changes to her arrangements or altered the feel of her songs, she sometimes felt sidelined. In interviews years later, Stevie admitted that there were moments when she felt her music was treated as less important than his or Christine McVie's. Some of her songs didn't make it onto albums, and others were altered in ways she didn't agree with. The combination of their past romantic history and their creative disagreements made these situations even harder to handle. What could have been simple artistic debates often turned into personal arguments. Lindsey's perfectionist tendencies weren't only directed at Stevie. Other band members also sometimes found his approach difficult. But because Stevie and Lindsey had such a complicated history, their conflicts tended to feel more personal and emotional, adding to the overall tension within the group. While the creative battles with Lindsey were playing out inside the band, Stevie was also facing serious personal struggles. By the late 1970s, she had developed a heavy cocaine habit. The lifestyle of constant touring, long recording sessions, and the party culture of the music industry made it easy for substance abuse to grow unchecked. At first, Stevie believed she was functioning well despite her drug use. She continued to write, record, and perform at a high level. But over time, the effects became more damaging. Cocaine started to take a toll on her health, her voice, and her energy. Friends and colleagues noticed changes in her behavior, including mood swings and periods of exhaustion. Her addiction reached a dangerous point in the early 1980s when doctors warned her that her cocaine use had caused a hole in the cartilage of her nose. It was a clear sign that the lifestyle she had been living was becoming physically destructive. This health scare would eventually lead her to seek help, but during this period, it only added to the chaos around her. Amid all of this, Stevie became involved in a romantic relationship with Mick Fleetwood, the band's drummer. This affair was controversial, not only because Mick was married at the time, but also because it caused more strain within the already fragile dynamics of the group. Both Stevie and Mick later admitted the relationship was a mistake and that it hurt people around them. For Stevie, the relationship with Mick wasn't about long-term commitment. It was a brief and complicated connection that grew out of shared loneliness and the intense environment they were living in. But even after it ended, the fallout lingered. It added another layer of tension between Stevie and Lindsey, as well as with other members of the band who disapproved of what had happened. Between Lindsey's tightening control over the music, Stevie's growing personal struggles, and the tangled web of relationships within Fleetwood Mac, the atmosphere inside the group became more and more volatile. Creative sessions were often fueled by unspoken resentments, and touring could feel like a test of endurance rather than a celebration of music. Things were about to reach a breaking point, and the next clash between Stevie and Lindsey wouldn't just be verbal, it would turn into one of their most infamous confrontations, near physical altercations. By the mid-1980s, Fleetwood Mac was still a hugely successful band, but the relationships inside it had become more fragile than ever. For Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham, years of creative disagreements, personal resentment, and unresolved feelings had built up. What had once been quiet tension now often boiled over into open conflict. Accounts from people who were there, band members, crew, and managers describe frequent screaming matches between Stevie and Lindsey during rehearsals and backstage. Sometimes the arguments were about music, arrangements, song tempos, or which material would make the final cut on an album. Other times they were personal, touching on their past relationship, private choices, or long-held grudges. The atmosphere during rehearsals could shift quickly. One moment they would be working through harmonies, and the next, voices would be raised, tempers would flare, and other members of the band would try to step in before things got out of control. Their shared history made the arguments more charged. Each disagreement carried the weight of years of emotional baggage. The most infamous confrontation came in 1987, shortly before Lindsey left the band. According to multiple accounts, the band had gathered at Christine McVie's house for a meeting to discuss plans for the upcoming tour. Tensions were already high, as Lindsey had been reluctant to commit to the tour schedule. At one point, the discussion turned heated between him and Stevie. Stevie later claimed that during this argument, Lindsey became physically aggressive. She alleged that he grabbed her and pushed her against a wall. Lindsey has denied some of the details, but several people who were present have said that the exchange was intense and unsettling. The incident left a lasting mark on Stevie, who described it as one of the most frightening moments she had experienced with him. Not long after that heated meeting, Lindsey made the decision to leave Fleetwood Mac. The announcement wasn't entirely unexpected. He had been frustrated for years with the band's internal politics, the creative compromises, and the constant drama. Lindsey also wanted to focus on his solo career, which gave him complete control over his music without the conflicts he faced in the group. The final straw was a combination of things: the ongoing fights with Stevie, disagreements over the direction of the band, and his reluctance to commit to another grueling tour. For Lindsey, stepping away meant protecting his sanity and his artistic vision. For Stevie, Lindsey's departure brought mixed emotions. On one hand, she felt relief. Without him in the band, she would no longer have to face daily confrontations or the constant battle over musical control. The emotional weight of being around him, especially after the physical confrontation, would be lifted. On the other hand, she knew what his absence meant for Fleetwood Mac musically. Lindsey's guitar playing, arrangements, and production skills were a big part of the band's sound. Losing him would change the creative dynamic in ways that could be difficult to replace. Stevie has admitted in later interviews that she recognized how important he was to the group, even if they couldn't get along personally. Reunions and old wounds. After Lindsey Buckingham left Fleetwood Mac in 1987, Stevie Nicks and Lindsey had long stretches without working together. But even when they weren't in the same room, their names were often linked in interviews. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Stevie occasionally revisited their past in public conversations, sometimes with clear frustration in her tone. When asked about their breakup, Stevie rarely softened the truth. She often described Lindsey as someone with a quick temper and a controlling streak, both in their romantic relationship and in their musical partnership. She told reporters that while Lindsey's perfectionism helped create great music, it also made him difficult to work with. She described situations where he would dismiss her ideas or insist on changing her songs to match his vision, leaving her feeling pushed aside. Stevie also spoke about Lindsey's inability to fully move on from the past. In interviews, she suggested that he sometimes treated her as if they were still in the middle of their breakup, even decades later. She recalled moments when old resentments seemed to rise to the surface without warning, especially when they were forced to work closely again. At the same time, Stevie could be careful with her words. Some of her comments were subtle digs rather than direct attacks. She might praise his talent in one breath, then follow it with a reminder of how hard he was to collaborate with. Fans and journalists learned to read between the lines. Stevie's remarks about Lindsey were rarely without layers. By the 2000s, their history had been retold so many times that it became part of Fleetwood Mac's identity. Every new tour or public appearance raised the question, had Stevie and Lindsey finally put the past behind them, or were they just better at hiding the tension? One of the most important moments in their later relationship came in 1997, when Fleetwood Mac reunited for The Dance. This live album and tour brought the classic lineup, Stevie, Lindsey, Christine McVie, John McVie, and Mick Fleetwood, back together for the first time in a decade. On stage, they smiled, harmonized, and performed songs that had defined their careers. To the audience, it looked like a celebration of their shared history. But behind the scenes, the old wounds had not healed. Stevie has since admitted that The Dance was not a reunion built on reconciliation. It was a professional decision, and both she and Lindsey knew how to keep their personal feelings from showing during performances. Still, some moments on stage hinted at the past. During performances of Silver Springs, a song Stevie had written about Lindsey years earlier, the intensity between them was obvious. In one famous televised performance, she sang the lyrics directly to him, her voice filled with emotion. Lindsey kept playing, but his expression showed that the song still carried weight. After The Dance, they continued to work together at times, both in Fleetwood Mac and on smaller projects. In 2003, they toured again with the album Say You Will, which was the first Fleetwood Mac record without Christine McVie. This meant Stevie and Lindsey had to carry even more of the creative load and spend more time in the studio together. The tension was still there. Stevie said in later interviews that while they could be civil, the working relationship was never completely easy. Lindsey's perfectionism and strong opinions continued to clash with her more free-flowing style. They could create beautiful music, but the process was often exhausting. Even in public appearances during this period, fans noticed moments of awkwardness, side glances, subtle body language, or long pauses when asked about each other in interviews. While they remained professional, the history between them was never far away. Stevie Nicks reveals the truth. In early 2018, Fleetwood Mac made headlines when it was announced that Lindsey Buckingham was no longer part of the band. The news shocked fans, especially because the lineup had seemed stable for several years. The details of what happened quickly became a public dispute between Lindsey and Stevie Nicks. According to Lindsey, the decision came out of nowhere. He claimed he was blindsided by the band's choice and only learned he had been removed after the fact. He said that disagreements over the timing of a tour were the main issue. He wanted to delay it to work on his solo projects, but the rest of the band was ready to move forward. Stevie told a very different story. In her version, the firing was not about tour schedules, but about what she described as an unhealthy, toxic environment. She alleged that Lindsey's behavior toward her had become intolerable, especially during public appearances. One specific incident she pointed to was the band's performance at a charity event in January 2018, where Lindsey allegedly mocked her on stage and rolled his eyes during her speech. She said it was the breaking point. Reports emerged that Stevie had given the band an ultimatum. Either Lindsey left or she would. While Stevie never used the word ultimatum in interviews, she made it clear that she could not continue working with him under the existing circumstances. Mick Fleetwood later admitted that the situation forced the band to choose. and they chose to move on without Lindsey. The split became messy in the press. Lindsey filed a lawsuit against the band for breach of contract, which was later settled out of court. The public exchange of statements made it obvious that the rift between Stevie and Lindsey had grown deeper than ever. After 2018, Stevie began speaking more openly about why she could no longer work with Lindsey. In interviews, she described a long history of what she saw as verbal abuse and emotional manipulation. She said that while Lindsey could be brilliant musically, he could also be cruel in the way he spoke to her and dismissed her contributions. She accused him of trying to creatively suppress her at times, pointing to earlier years when her songs were changed or cut down without her agreement. Stevie claimed that Lindsey often made her feel small in the studio, as if her ideas were less valuable than his. While she had mentioned these frustrations in earlier decades, her tone after 2018 was more blunt and final. Stevie also spoke about the emotional toll of their relationship, both in the past and in more recent years. She said that working with him often brought back the pain of their breakup, as if the wounds had never fully healed. The combination of personal history and professional conflict made it, in her view, impossible to have a healthy working relationship. One of her most direct statements came in 2020, when she said she would never work with Lindsey Buckingham again under any circumstances. She explained that the decision wasn't made lightly, but that she felt peace after finally drawing that boundary. She emphasized that she wished him well in his own career, but that their paths needed to remain separate for her own well-being. For fans, these comments made it clear that the split was not just a temporary fight. It was the end of a partnership that had shaped some of the most famous music of the 1970s and beyond. The creative magic they once had was overshadowed by decades of unresolved conflict, and Stevie had reached the point where she would no longer compromise her comfort to keep it going. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more celebrity stories.